We've just heard from South Africa's Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan. He started off his budget speech, much anticipated, I must say, quite philosophically. He spoke about the need for South Africa to rise above the legacy of apartheid, to tap into the potential of the country now that we're entering the BRIC club of emerging market economies, and then spoke about policy and how, from his point of view, South Africa is in a sound financial position despite the challenges that the country's incurred coming out of a recession in the last 18 months or so. Core to the theme was jobs, which reiterated a focus of the president in his State of the Nation address. Jobs, 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 particularly addressing the issue of youth unemployment. The budget speech delivered with a lot of flair and levity, but quite a lot of technical inputs as to how much money is to be spent, where the revenue is going to come from, how much of a budget deficit South Africa is likely to incur. It's rising as opposed to being constrained, debt to GDP ratios, all those kinds of things. Joining me on the desk is an illustrious group of economists. Paul Theron, you all know him, director at Vestact. Mandy, head of tax technical at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Kevin Lings, also a familiar face, an economist at Stanlib. And Sheshi, Kaniki, senior economist at Momentum. Before we get their points of view, let's head over now to the steps of Parliament. Stephen Gunyan's standing by. What's the mood like, Stephen?
Well, Lerato, I don't think the mood carries is quite the same as we had with the State of the Nation address earlier this month, probably because it's taking place during the daytime rather than the evening. I don't think people dress up to the same extent, but lots of camaraderie between the Minister, the Deputy Minister, the Director General and the Governor of the Reserve Bank, also the SARS Commissioner, Arpa Magashula, as they gave a press conference just before going into the National Assembly to give that speech. And as you said, jobs are main focus. I have a picture of jobs on the front cover of the budget statement this year, and we have two female construction workers, so also playing to another theme that came out of the budget, and that's infrastructure spending, and hopefully an acceleration of infrastructure spending as we enter 2011.
Obviously, Stephen, he has identified the various components of the new growth path and the various ministries strategic to this issue of unlocking South Africa's jobs potential. How have the opposition parties responded?
Well, we haven't heard from the opposition parties yet. This paper on the youth subsidy goes to NEDLAC this week, so we may see some opposition when that goes to NEDLAC on Friday afternoon. We're still waiting to speak to some of the opposition parties, though, to see their reaction to that youth subsidy.
Okay, thanks so much to you, Stephen Gunyan. Obviously, he'll be speaking to a variety of opposition leaders, getting a reaction post the budget, which the Minister is just wrapping up in Parliament at the moment, and then speaking to the Minister, of course, later on. Right now, let's get a discussion of this budget. Let's start with you, Paul Theron. Youth unemployment is obviously the bugbear in South Africa, and today we finally got clarity. There is a jobs fund and there is a wage subsidy. It's two separate things.
That stuff all looks good, as promised. I think what comes through in a budget like this is we're talking about a serious economy, a 3 trillion rand economy, a big budget, marginally additional allocations, social services continuing their massive spend in education, and as you say, these additional initiatives. There's a big debate about whether or not the state can really engender additional jobs in the economy, or whether it's something more related to the general environment. But as far as it goes, it looks as though some of those initiatives are out there, and we'll have to look and see how they do over the year ahead.
Carl, your views on this issue of jobs? We're talking about a 5 billion rand rollover over 3 years, particularly for entry-level workers.
I think it's a good thing. It's not new news. It was announced last year, and obviously subject to some concerns expressed by COSATU, particularly it was held over. But it's good to see that it's back on the table. I think it's important.
Kevin, your views, 9 billion rands for a jobs fund. Are we clear what it's supposed to do?
No, we're not. We're still not clear how the 9 billion rand is going to be enacted. In other words, how do you tap into that 9 billion? And remember that it's over a number of years. So it's not as if 9 billion is available each year. But to me, it's important that we're moving kind of in the right direction. Remember that last year in the budget, the Minister announced the possibility of a wage subsidy for the youth. That was shot down by COSATU, and we felt during the year that thought had gone away. I'm thrilled to see that it's back in the budget. Yes, it's only 5 billion, so you've got, as you say, a 9 billion employment fund. We're not sure how that's going to be affected. And then in addition, a 5 billion subsidy for the youth, again over 3 years. That will be administered by the revenue services. So probably how it will work is that you can employ somebody and then claim back at the end of the tax year a certain amount of that person's salary from the revenue service as a subsidy. How much it's going to be per person, we're not entirely sure. My suspicion is what is happening here is that the minister has managed to get this back into the budget, probably after a little bit of discussion, and he's putting his toe in the water. In other words, to see whether or not this type of thing is effective. He's saying that the youth subsidy will create 178,000 jobs. I assume that's over 3 years. Now, the test is going to be, does it get taken up, does it get used?
Sheshi, your views on this one, 178,000 new jobs, partly subsidized wages through the subsidy, particularly targeting those earning less than 60,000 rands per annum. What would business do about this? Would they respond?
Well, I think I'd have to agree with my colleagues that it's a positive thing. We need to take action around the issue of job creation. We saw the economy create 157,000 jobs between the third and fourth quarter of last year. So when you look at that number, you think, well, on the back of where we've just come off, clearly coming out of recession, perhaps it's doable. Most of those jobs came through the public sector, and what we do need to see is more jobs coming through the private sector. I think the critical issue around creating jobs for me has still not been touched, and perhaps the budget is not the place for that. And that's the issue of our labor market efficiency, around how do we hire workers, the flexibility of wage negotiations. Those kind of things are where South Africa is lagging behind very, very far its peers. And I think this kind of initiative needs to go alongside addressing those type of issues.
Well, gentlemen, I think an important point has been raised here, and it's not an issue peculiar to South Africa. The job of the government is to create an enabling environment. It is not to create jobs. Business ought to be doing so. And right now we're seeing better results from companies, better margins, all those kinds of issues, but we're not seeing expansion by way of creating jobs.
But there are 3 kinds of jobs in the country. I mean, if you work for a private company, or you may be employed by a parastatal like Transnet or Eskom, or you might be simply a teacher or a policeman or a prison warder. In that last category, there certainly has been massive expansion. We know that police have been expanded. We know that 190 billion rand is going into the education system. We know that the president is concerned that many of those people don't work for a full 7 hours. They're involved with alcohol abuse and abusing of the students in the schools. So we talk about problems with regard to jobs, but there are clearly problems in the kind of jobs that are being created. A lot of the attention needs, we arguing here, to be on those private sector jobs. And there are industries out there which have no help from government whatsoever. They create jobs anyway, so long as the environment is as helpful as possible.
But Paul, don't you think that to be a little bit fairer, that in this particular budget, he's tried to emphasize some of that? In other words, what hasn't come through is him saying, well, the private sector the government is going, or the public sector is going to lead the way in terms of jobs. He's not saying that. He's actually saying we've got an employment fund, we've got a wage subsidy. I like that he acknowledged the role of small business in creating jobs. Of course, he didn't back that up with much more than saying small business is important. But at least it's acknowledging the role of the private sector in creating jobs, which is a different slant, I feel, to what we've heard in a lot of the discussion leading up to this. In other words, that the public sector would lead the role.
We'll talk about those incentives in a little bit. 73 billion rands for state building projects, other words, expanded public works projects, which have actually been an inheritance in many ways from the Trevor Manuel years. Are they effective?
I think the big problem with
Anyone?
the big problem with that is about capacity to spend the money. We've already seen a significant underspending when it comes to infrastructure spending, and the problem, particularly at municipal levels and so on, is about capacity.
If you look at what he's budgeting for, the total infrastructure spend over, and he'll focus on the medium-term budget policy, the next 3 years. He's not going to focus so much on this year. It's just over 800 billion. So he's still putting out a very big number in terms of not just government infrastructure, but the entire infrastructure program, which includes the SOEs or public corporations. Now, what concerns me a little bit is if I look at that 800 billion, it's slightly less than where we had in October, and that was slightly less than February. So it's suggesting to me that he's still got to focus on infrastructure, but he's not able to up that and to get the momentum going in terms of infrastructure. So it's still a key issue, but maybe not getting an accelerating attention, if that makes sense.
Okay, before we look at the broader expenditure of the government, this whole issue of state building projects, which is where you're supposed to absorb just a little bit at least of manual labor for a short space of time, does it work?
Well, I think it can work to a degree, but I think any employment creation strategy must be broad-based. It must tackle several sectors, and I think we've identified a number of sectors. Infrastructure is one. We've identified agriculture. We've identified tourism, agro-processing, manufacturing. These are the sectors in the new growth part that have been identified as having an capacity to absorb labor quickly. And I think what would be helpful as a step forward now, we have a job fund. How can we link that job fund to the requirements and the objectives of building employment in those sectors? Because what the minister said today is that there's a process whereby you would apply, whether you're in public or the private sector, for those funds on a competitive basis. I think the framework needs to be slightly tighter, and I'm sure government is working on that to ensure that we link what has been put on the table today from a finance point of view to what other spheres of government are proposing.
Paul raised an interesting issue, and you were very quick to sort of rebut that. But it's an issue that we know of as South Africans, is taxpayers' money is used to try to stimulate some kind of jobs initiative. Then you get civil service jobs like teachers and police, and then there's very little by way of delivery, by way of accountability, by way of efficiency. And if I understood you correctly, for you that's problematic.
Well, I'm extremely positive about the future of the economy, and I think we're going to do well as a country in the decades that lie ahead. I'm not very encouraged on the jobs front because I think there's a whole portion of the South African potential workforce which are totally unemployable and not likely to become particularly employable in the foreseeable future. So there your social grants are important and trying to ameliorate the effects of that grinding poverty. As the economy expands and we have favorable terms of trade with other parts of the world and high commodity prices, I think we'll do okay. And certainly agriculture and tourism and all those absorptive sectors, I hope, will do well. But I think in the short term, we all just have to do our best in our own spheres. And government needs to do its best too in terms of keeping things as efficient as possible. You know, we mustn't be unrealistic, but at the same time, we mustn't be too pessimistic.
Just a final question very briefly, anybody. Did we get any clarity as to this proposed new growth path and the 5 million jobs to be created in 10 years and whether or not this budget starts to address any of those issues?
Look, the objectives of the new growth path are repeated within the budget, partly in the budget speech, certainly in the budget review, and there's a repeating of that objective, 5 million jobs in 10 years. And I think the minister would argue that he's going some way in trying to deliver on that, particularly by way of the various funds that he's created. What we're not entirely sure about, obviously, is how effective are these going to be. Now, from my perspective, I'd rather have these funds in place than not have them there at all. So while we overwhelmingly agree that it's the role of the private sector, I'd like to see some incentivization. And maybe try something. I think this youth subsidy is a fantastic idea. Let's try it. Maybe it works over the next couple of years, maybe it doesn't, but at least we're trying something. So I think he's going down that road. I still think the new growth path is fairly ambiguous as to what it's all about.